Nice.
Did you get it going?
Hers is good.
Hers is working? Text the camera, see what's going on. We're off. Put that one on.
Oh, the microphone.
Microphone.
Another couple of minutes for Councilor McLaughlin. If he's not here in 2 minutes, we'll get started, or until I finish this.
I was going to say, and I can let everyone know we do have snacks in the back, so please feel free. We have lots of them. The other night, I know you had to turn it up for a part of it. And then
Louder than others.
when we went back down, it was still kind of feedback through the ring. And so I need to go down a little more. Right. And Brian, when we get going, I'll just have to slide this mic over, and then those two will kind of share that one, but they will want us to speak into the mic so they have the record.
Yep.
What about this? My calendar, phone went off at 15 till.
Beep. Right now.
I was in my slippers and
To order, welcome everybody to the special meeting of the City Council. Would the city clerk please call the roll?
Counselor Long. Present. Counselor McLaughlin. Absent. Counselor Runyon.
present.
Counselor Randall.
Present.
Counselor Richardson.
Present.
Mayor Mates.
Present. Would everybody please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands,
one nation, under God, indivisible, with
with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, I'm looking for a motion to approve the agenda.
Mr. Mayor, I'll move to approve the agenda.
Thank you.
I'll second that.
It's moved by Counselor Randall and seconded by Counselor Long to approve the agenda. Is there any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. We're ready for our discussion item. I'll turn it over to our Director of Public Works.
Thank you, Mayor Mays. As council will recall, we're in the middle of a project to update the city's 20-year water master plan. This water master plan will analyze our current and project future water supplies and demands. will evaluate the city's existing water infrastructure, and it'll develop a capital improvement plan to maintain the existing water system infrastructure and develop new systems to meet future water demands of the community, as well as comply with new and anticipated future drinking water regulations. The last thing the plan will do is we'll develop a financial plan to meet the operational and capital needs of the water utility. Council may recall, we have not raised or adjusted the city's water rates for 9 years, and the financial evaluation is timely at this time because we're to the point where growth in a community and the associated water revenues have flattened out, and inflation and costs has caught up with those revenues. Today, we're going to be presenting information to the council related to different concepts and issues related to water utility financial management. And we'll be seeking direction from the council about which concepts it supports and which should not be pursued further. With the direction we received today, this team will go back and draft financial scenarios, which we'll bring back to the council at a second work session in August. The direction received in August will be the basis for the financial plan that will be included in the water master plan, which is scheduled for completion near the end of 2024. With us today are Brian Ginter and Emily Flock from Consor Engineering. They're the consulting firm who the city has hired to update the water master plan, and Deb Ghilardi, who's a principal with Ghilardi Rothstein Group, and she is responsible for developing the financial plan. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Brian.
Thanks. We are still having technical difficulties on the Zoom side. All right.
While we're waiting, or would you prefer we ask questions during the presentation or hold our questions until the end?
Please go ahead and ask questions as we go. All right, so I'll just jump right in. Dave already did the introduction. So yeah, I'm Brian Ginter. With me is Emily Flock and Deb Ghilardi. So what we're going to talk about today is just a quick overview of why we do a master plan, what's in the master plan. So this will be high level. We're kind of at about the halfway stage, past halfway in schedule, but about halfway in terms of the work that's done. So this is a good time for us to give you a primer on what we're doing, where we're going, what we're going to see as the big issues and challenges that we're working through, so that when we do come back at the end of the year, you've kind of got that basis for where we're going, and we don't hit you with so much technical information all at once at the end. So we'll talk about what's in the master plan, the engineering technical piece, and then spend a fair amount of time on the financial analysis, kind of introduction and policy discussion, and then wrap up with just a quick summary of where we're at in terms of current status, next steps, and then time for Q&A at the end. But as said, please feel free to interrupt us as we go, and we can answer questions as we go, so you're not having to hold 20 slides worth of questions to the end. All right, so starting with why master plan, and I always start with the least exciting, kind of boring reason. You have to do it. The State Department of Human Services Drinking Water Program requires every water system to maintain a water system master plan. That you have to have a 20-year plan. Your last one was done in 2006, and so it's time to update. What's in the plan and why is it useful to the city? It identifies short and long-term needs for the system, starting with capital improvements. That's always number one. Where do you need to make investments? It addresses policy updates, so understanding where are we going with the water system, and then ultimately a financial strategy to support your policy for the water system, and also those capital improvements that need to be made. Ideally, the master plan will help to improve level of service to customers. So, we're going to support economic development with the water system. We want to make sure that water isn't the reason that the city can't continue to thrive and grow and meet its objectives. We want to make sure the water system is reliable. So both seismic and climate resilience is an important piece of this. We want to make sure that you can deliver water to customers 365 days a year without interruption. This is critical. Capacity expansion is always an important piece of a master plan. Cities are always growing. The Dalles is no different, and we want to make sure, again, that the water system can support that growth. There's a need to maintain the system. There's a significant investment in all of that infrastructure. So prioritizing those capital investments that need to be made in the infrastructure that's there, it doesn't last forever. And then finally, making sure that the developer standards have been identified and support the plan that we've identified in the master plan. So it really is, I view it as a roadmap, both short-term and long-term, for where the city's water system is going. Ideally, it guides capital investments and the overall planning. And again, as I said, it's required at a minimum of every 20 years for communities that are growing. It's typical to update approximately every 10 years, so somewhere in that range. And it is a couple-year process, so something you want to start and maintain. And it's dependent on the types of growth and change that's happening in the water system. The city's experiencing a fair amount of growth. Infrastructure is getting old. It is time to do a plan, and so that's why we're doing it today. So this is just a kind of quick overview of what's in the plan, and we break it up into 4 parts. Kind of the foundational piece first is an inventory of the water system. So that's a chapter that's written, unfortunately, still pretty engineering, but the idea is that it provides an overview of how does water get distributed to customers. So it's a nice, useful tool for the public as well as for public works staff and the water system operators. And then water demand forecast. So we want to look and see how is the community using water today and how will water be used in the future, because we need to plan for that future condition. Where is the city growing? Where is there going to be additional water use? How might water use change over time? And then the performance criteria. So we establish the basis of our analysis. What's the performance we want from the system so that when we analyze it, we have a sound basis for that. That performance criteria gets established through a combination of industry standards, state and federal regulations, and then overall the city's goals and policies related to level of service and performance. Once we get the foundation complete, then we move into the analysis part. So we build a hydraulic model. We calibrate it, so we make sure that the model, the computerized model, reflects the actual performance of the system. And then we analyze the hydraulics of the system to make sure that there's adequate capacity in the pipelines to move water around the system where demand is. And that's primarily driven by summer demands and the need to meet fire flow conditions. So fire suppression flows at hydrants is a critical driver because that's really when you stress the water system the most. And then we look at supply and treatment needs. Is there enough water available, water resources available to meet the needs of customers? In-town storage and pumping needs to be able to move the water throughout the system and have enough of a reserve and storage to be able to meet those peak demands like fire suppression needs. And then seismic and also climate resiliency. So looking at what are the things that could impact the regular performance of the system and how resilient is it to those conditions? What improvements can we make to make sure that the system will continue to perform through those types of events? Once we've completed that piece, then we start moving into the numbers. So capital improvement plan is next. So we're going to develop capital improvements to meet those capacity, reliability, resilience, and significantly maintenance needs. So the Dalles is no different than a lot of communities in Oregon. Capital maintenance is almost as significant as what's needed for expansion. And we want to make sure we capture both those costs. We aren't just focused on adding capacity without looking at what do we need to do to maintain, to renew and replace the existing system as we go. That wraps up the primary parts of the engineering analysis. And then that's where Deb takes over and we do the financial analysis and we wrap up the report. So she'll look at utility rate structure and system development charges. She'll talk about that a lot more later in this presentation. And then ultimately with the water system master plan, we come back to you for approval, both at the council level, here policymakers, and then also regulatory approval through the state. So we're, and I'll cover it later as well, but we're basically right in the middle of the system analysis piece right now. So it's a good time to be presenting sort of this foundational information.
Are we required to develop system development charges by law according to a formula, or can we pretty well just name it as whatever we want to do?
I'll be talking more about that in the second half of this presentation.
Okay, thanks.
With that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily for a few minutes.
We'll start with the first overview of sort of your inventory of your system and the infrastructure that is in place currently.
We'll get you to move the microphone a little closer, please.
So this will start surface water supply overview. So right now, a lot of your water comes from Dog River, and there is a diversion pipeline, which is mostly constructed. Small elements of that project are being completed. I'm sure you're familiar with, and that it's diverted to the South Fork Mill Creek, which ends up in the Crow Creek Reservoir behind Crow Creek Dam. Wicks Water Treatment Plant pulls from South Fork Mill Creek and from the reservoir. It treats your surface supply water, and then the Mill Creek and the Highline transmission mains run about 7 miles from the treatment plant to your city distribution system. And that is the surface water portion. The other portion of your supply comes from groundwater. So there are currently 3 existing wells in the city, Lone Pine, Marks, and Jordan. They provide groundwater and they pull from what we call the Dalles Pool Aquifer. And then currently under construction are the Riverside wells 1 and 2. They also pull from the same aquifer. And once water gets to your system, you have to distribute it amongst your customers. And so this is an overview of your distribution system. The color blocks are the different pressure zones. And so the distribution system is set up to provide appropriate pressures throughout your system, which varies largely based on elevation, ground level changes. And so your treatment plant is actually higher elevation. So it flows by gravity to the southern portion of your town, which is the higher elevation. And then it fills reservoirs and it sort of flows down with pressure reducing valves to other pressure zones. Then the wells are distributed, but they are typically lower elevation. So they are actually pumped up to your storage, which then cascades down to the various pressure zones. So here's a quick inventory of your reservoirs and your pump stations. And so the reservoirs provide buffer for fluctuations in your demand throughout the day, as well as fire suppression, source for that water if needed. And then emergency, if anything were to disrupt your supply or some other emergency happens, they would provide emergency storage so that you can continue to serve customers. And then, as you can see, there are 5 current, and there are 2 proposed, the 2 Riverside 1 and 2. And then you have 3 pump stations, which move water around the system. Typically, they move source water up and then they flow down from reservoirs. And you have another proposed Riverside pump station as well. So, moral of the story, there's quite a bit of infrastructure that is in place that serves your system and provides water on a daily basis. Quick overview. So that's about 90 miles of distribution pipeline in the ground right now. That's what serves your system. Over 90% of that is cast iron or ductile iron as the main materials in the ground. And you'll see the largest category there in age is 50 to 75 years ago is when it was installed. Next slide. This is a map, a little bit hard to see, but this light blue is when it was installed sort of in the 1925 to 1950 period of time. And that's that 50 to 75-year-old pipeline. Most pipe materials we typically treat with about 75 years of useful life. So a fair amount of the distribution piping is at or nearing its typical use of life, which leads to Brian mentioning that there's renewal and replacement is a big portion of this master plan and understanding what that will take and setting you up for that in the future.
It's interesting. I can't tell the difference in some of these colors, but it looks like we have some pipes that we have no idea how old they are.
There are indeed a few unknown. It's not significant portions, and that is
They're down there toward the river. That's
There's
the
a
older
few.
part of the city, I would think, you know.
Yeah, and it's a variety of things. So this is based on the GIS system, and so it's as the GIS system gets updated, these pieces will be updated, but there's not a large piece that we're concerned about.
And I can offer that you're exactly right. Oftentimes those are the oldest parts of the system. Some of it's pre-1900.
Would think it's pre-1850 based on this, but yeah. Thanks.
And so that is a brief overview of your existing infrastructure. And then the next portion that we move into is demand forecasting. And so first we look at historical usage and understand the different characteristics of that usage. So this is a figure that shows sort of the split between residential and non-residential usage. The top 2 graphs are from the previous 2006 master plan, and the bottom 2 graphs are from our current work. And so you'll see that the diagonal pieces are about the same. So the 2006 master plan was pretty much dead on with what we are seeing now in your usage between residential and non-residential. And as you can see, the orange portion is growing. And so the non-residential demands are increasing in your system over time. We've seen in 2006, that plan identified that and was planning for that transition, and it continues that planning through now.
that increase in orange is due to Google, right?
Largely. It's all of our non-resident, commercial and industrial combined.
And there is a portion of governmental use for parks and other things, and that is part of your non-residential use as well. So this graph shows the average day demand projections. And again, we've placed the 2006 data on here to show that it lines up pretty well with where you are now. And then the projections jump a little bit with non-industrial demand increases in the shorter term, 10 years, and then it sort of levels out a little bit more inclusive with population growth. And this is average day, so it's your total sum of usage over the year divided by 365. And we use the PSU population projections to project population. And then we use our understanding and information on the commercial and industrial to project non-residential. This is very similar. So this is your max day demand. And so most infrastructure is sized to provide fire flow conditions on max day demand. That is typically a performance criteria that we are looking to provide service for. And so the max day demand is used heavily in our analysis. And similar growth with your non-industrial, and then sort of leveling out a little bit and increasing over time. And so this shows our existing is the 9, 20-year projection is the 15.6, and then your 50-year projection is at 19.
If I could just offer a little bit of context with relation to the 2006 master plan, which is shown up here in blue. And as Emily's noted, we pretty much hit it. I mean, that's kind of unusual to actually be right in your future water demand projections. But we undertook, and the 2006 master plan was completed before there was any discussion of data centers. They came in with the proposal for the first data center came in just as we were adopting the 2006 master plan. We had to do an amendment just to talk about what additional piping would be needed to get the water exactly where it was going to be used. But we used, without knowing what type of industry might come in and develop on the port, we just use an industrial allowance to account for development of those acres sometime in the future. We also, I believe, if I recall correctly, included a weather allowance in case things were getting hotter and people would be using more water just because of that. Those two things, actually, like I say, happened to have worked out for us, and we pretty much hit those numbers. And now we're utilizing the best information we have available to us today to project forward to water demands for the next 20 years.
This slide, I'll hit just one more item quick. So we have both the 20-year and 50-year forecast. So as we talked about, as you saw, you've got piping that's been in the ground for 100 years. That's going to continue to be the case. And so we are required to provide a 20-year plan. We have a 20-year plan, but we also want to look out to a much longer time frame and make sure that as we're recommending infrastructure that's going to go in the ground in the next 10 years, it's sized for the long-term need. The last thing we want to do is recommend a 12-inch pipe when a 16 is actually what you need for the long term, because we want that to be able to stay in the ground again for another 50 to 100 years and serve customer needs. So we look at both of those timeframes as we size infrastructure to both balance when is it needed. So we're not recommending it too soon, but also is it sized for that long-term need?
I remember those meetings, Dave. I was on the Port Commission at that time prior to the development of the port. And there was a lot of water planning at that time. And I think most of it worked out really well.
It did. And you might recall some of those conversations were, are we building too much? Are we putting in a Cadillac where a Hyundai might do or something like that? And we've actually ended up ultimately validating, because of what did move in there, those original planning assumptions. So we're trying to be conservative in that same way as we move forward for the next 20 and 50 years.
Just to be clear, Dave, everybody. Just to be clear, 20 years is required, but we're doing 50 years to be.
We're doing a
Extra.
20-year plan, but for the water demand projection, we're looking at 50. Yes.
Thank you.
questions?
All right, so once we've kind of have an understanding of the existing system, we've developed the hydraulic model, we've forecasted demands for the 20-year and 50-year horizon, and we've established our criteria, then we move into analysis. And so I'll just kind of walk through the components of the analysis. So it really starts from where does the water come from all the way to how does it get to the customer. So start with source of supply. Do we have an adequate source of supply to meet both the annual volume need, that average day demand, enough water to get through the year, as well as enough water to deliver to the system on max day demand. So we look at both those conditions. We also look at month-to-month variations because, as you know, the Dalles is in a dry climate. So it means that there is a bit of an abundance of water in the winter relative to demand, and generally a shortage of water in the summer available. And so you have to do things like raw water storage in order to get through summer events. And so we look at supply from all of those angles: total volume, peak day delivery, and also seasonal variations in the system. That water has to be treated to meet federal and state drinking water standards. And so we look at the treatment systems to say, does it perform to deliver the type of water quality that the city desires, the quantity that's needed, and is it reliable? So the treatment systems are evaluated. And then hydraulic capacity using the hydraulic model. So we're going to look at capacity of the pipelines under a max day demand plus fire flow condition. That's the extreme case we want to look at. Hottest day in the summer, if there was a fire, is there enough water at adequate pressure at the hydrants in order to meet that need? Storage volumes are next. As Emily said, storage is required for a number of things. Usually the fire suppression water is stored there. You've got a certain amount of emergency water because your water system is made up of mechanical and electrical components that can fail. We want to have that storage available so that you can meet demands from that while staff are out addressing those kinds of failures or emergencies. Pumping capacity is critical. Again, you have to move water up through the system. We need to make sure that we can get the water where it's needed. We'll look at the overall physical condition of the system, both the structures themselves, reservoirs and pump stations, as well as the buried infrastructure to make sure that we're planning for renewal and replacement. And then finally, taking a look at resilience. Both climate and seismic resilience are important issues that we're all facing today, understanding that there are external drivers that can impact the water system, and we want to make sure we've planned for that. And as we said, and I'll keep kind of hitting it because it's important, one of the critical things for this community is the need to plan for renewal and replacement. A lot of the water system is aging, and so it is a balance between providing capacity for future growth and addressing those aging facilities going forward. So I'll kind of jump into a couple of the topics here, dig a little bit deeper. So the first one, just to talk about where we are with water supply. As Emily described, you've got this combination of raw water supply or surface water supply from two locations. You've got raw water storage and you've got groundwater. But all of those combined at their current capacities don't meet that long-term need going forward. So there's going to be a need for supply expansion. And you've got essentially four options or some combination of four options that we'll be looking at and bringing back to you. And it will be driven by feasibility and cost. And does it meet the long-term needs, the ability to phase the improvements in? Those are the types of things we'll be looking at. So starting up in the watershed, the first would be to expand Crow Creek Reservoir. Additional raw water storage would allow you to store more of the winter water in the winter and have it available to meet an increasing summer demand through the summer. That's a significant infrastructure improvement, and so not a small cost potentially. So we're going to weigh that against what are your other alternatives. So as we move down to town, the next option would be the development of what we call ASR, aquifer storage and recovery. And the idea here is that you take that extra winter surface water and instead of storing it up in Crow Creek Reservoir, you transmit it down to town. It gets recharged into those wells that you have in the city. So it could be either your existing wells, the future Riverside wells, or wells that we haven't even contemplated yet, stored in the same aquifer that you're drawing groundwater from. It creates a bubble of surface water. So you're filling the bathtub up essentially so that you've got more water available to pump in the summertime. The third option is to develop groundwater in another aquifer deeper than the current one that your wells tap into. And so this presents an opportunity to get to another water source that isn't used by a lot of other water users in the area. So additional water resource to tap into. And then the fourth option is to develop the Columbia River as another surface water source closer to town. So we'll be looking at all four of those. They each have pros and cons and significant costs. And so looking at which one best provides that kind of balance of cost and reliability going forward is going to drive those improvements. And Spoiler alert, it may be a combination of a couple of them is what it takes to actually meet your needs going forward.
The last council meeting, Dave, you talked about that 80-20 ratio, this map does not have the two new Riverside wells on it. And those are in the port area, right? The Google is, and so that's what you were talking about. When those two are up and running, that 20% will increase.
That's correct. And just to be clear, their analysis for all the future planning includes the development of those two new wells. So they aren't being overlooked in any way. Their production and their inclusion into the system is anticipated in all the analysis they're doing for this next 20-year period.
I have a follow-up on that, if you don't mind. Dave, in this analysis, is ASR being factored in, or is that is still a question mark for us?
No, say it. I don't want to steal his thunder a little bit later on, but yes, it's a factor as well.
Okay,
I
thank you.
think that's part of the spoiler alert as far as it being a combination of options.
Yep, that's exactly right. ASR is the one that complements the others. If you look at the other three, those are all very significant capital cost, long-term projects. ASR has the potential to both be a bridge to one of those future solutions and then also to complement those other options to be able to reduce some of the cost and spread it out over time.
And I guess just to close the loop on that, it won't be in the end of discussion about ASR, but just as an update, one of the two new wells that's just been drilled on the port, the Riverside 1 and 2.
Yeah.
One of those is an ASR well.
Right.
So we are going online probably this next winter with the first ASR well.
I guess, and not to drill too deeply at this point, but my question being really, that's a potential that we had hoped for, was that we would get storage capacity. I don't know that we've discussed whether that's a reality or a certainty yet.
I think you're going to touch on that.
Yeah, and I can do it now actually. So yeah, I mean ASR is not a guarantee. It should be more specific. Any work when you're talking about groundwater has a level of uncertainty to it. So first, is there water available in the aquifer? We know that because you've got multiple wells in the aquifer already. And then secondly, at the location where the well is drilled, is the water there? That is not a given, we've learned in groundwater. So there's risk at that step. The next step is, is the water that's there accessible at the well? So the formation itself, can you get the water at the rate you want without drawing down the aquifer too much around the well? Becomes the next thing. And then the reverse of that, which is if you can pump the water out, then do you have the ability to also recharge the aquifer at that location? So instead of draw down, you end up with draw up in the aquifer. And so there's a point of, well, how much water can we recharge into the, can we push into the aquifer at that location? And so those are all things that hydrogeologists look at. They make their best guess. It's educated based on what they know. And then you find out for sure when you actually put water in the ground.
So will we have certainty of that after this winter? In other words, do we finish the plan before we know what ASR?
We did the
actually
first
looks?
steps that Brian outlined as far as the feasibility. Now, everything that we could do prior to actually doing ASR to see if it works. We did all of that. We had to do that to get the permits and the water rights necessary from Oregon Water Resources Department to move forward. The next step is that we do begin trying ASR and we see how the aquifer actually responds. Does that water remain there, available for us to pull out, or is the aquifer so leaky that it just all runs away from us? Our best information is that it's going to stay there. But the next step is finish the construction of this well, go into recharge this next season, see how the aquifer responds, and we'll be doing monitoring at the well where the water's injected and also surrounding wells to see what the influence might be.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say there will be certainty after season one. I think that's probably a multi-season, 2 or 3 year effort of recharging and drawdown to see exactly what those responses are before we get to the point where I would use the word certainty.
So we need to finish the plan with that as sort of a question mark.
Yeah.
All right.
I will jump in, and the other portion of ASR is where is the water coming from? And so there's a supply question on that side. So typically you'd be taking surface water, so from Crow Creek Reservoir, Dog River, South Fork, Mill Creek, etc., putting it down into your well. Surface water needs to be treated, so Wicks treatment capacity does limit some of that, depending, that's part of the discussion of does that expand it. And I will say, so in terms of uncertainty, also rainfall is very uncertain, right? So the river flows fluctuate greatly as well. And then there is runoff that often happens, a lot of your runoff peaks in the spring. And so it is a very large peak. And so there is some question of how do you capture that well with ASR. ASR typically likes more consistent influence over time, and some of your raw water is not available at that timing. So some of our monthly evaluations are looking at some of those constraints and how does that work? How do all those pieces fit together?
Is one of those constraints how quickly you can actually recharge the well with the ASR with the well that you're using?
Yeah, so yes, you will have to, whether the well, how fast it can be recharged, how fast you can actually put water into the ground and have it spread out in aquifer. And then behind that, you have how fast can you treat the water? There's an instantaneous rate there. So yes, you store it to so supply over. All questions? Brian and I currently are kicking around quite a bit.
And we will not have all the answers when this plan is done. And so what you will see as a just kind of when we're back in August, it won't be do this. This is the answer. Absolutely start. These are all, with the exception of ASR, they're all 10-year types of implementations or longer. And so it's starting the process now to reduce risk and make sure it's smart capital investment. So we'll be prioritizing what makes the most sense, what are the next steps, but in all likelihood, a couple of the options will remain on the table, and it will be, what are the next things you need to do to determine which is the right strategy going forward and to minimize capital investment as long as possible until you've reduced risk to the minimum amount. They all require some degree of state and federal permitting with a number of agencies, very similar to your Dog River pipeline project that took
25.
a very long time to implement. These are of similar scale. And so that is the kind of timelines we're talking about in terms of where we're going. You have options and it's determining, well, which one's going to be the most cost effective and technically feasible. I won't talk too much on this one other than to say the Wicks water treatment plant has both challenges and opportunities. So the challenge is it is aging. The plant has been well ran, but by a series of operators who have kept it going probably well beyond the typical service life of a water treatment plant. It continues to serve the city well, but there is a lot of that infrastructure at the plant that is reached, again, the end of its life. As we look at source options, we'll be looking at, okay, well, what capacity of water do we need to be able to treat at Wicks, both in the winter and in the summer? So that's going to be a change from where you're at today. Winter treatment needs could increase significantly with ASR because we need to treat more water to be able to bring it down and store it in the aquifer. Summer treatment needs are going to continue to increase, but we want to make sure that that treatment capacity is aligned with the total capacity of your surface water source. So we're starting to get to all these intermixed variables now where we need to think about what's the right plan for Wicks in the future, knowing where your long-term water supply is going to come from. It likely means over time a change in treatment technology to some degree, to more modern technologies that better treat winter cold water. You get very cold water coming down out of the Crow Creek watershed, which creates a number of challenges, as well as some variations in summer usage. And so we want a plant going forward that is resilient and reliable for the range of water quality conditions we're anticipating looking forward to its next 50 years of operation. And then how do you implement those improvements while continuing to maintain operation of the plant? And so this will be, again, a significant capital project. You will see when we come back to you with the plan will be a phased implementation of upgrades at the Wicks water treatment plant. The next piece covers a combination of both capacity and expansion as well as renewal and replacement. So the most visible sign of water system improvements is water line being installed in the ground, trenches, roads being disrupted, traffic being disrupted. You drive by, you see a trench. Well, it's pipeline being replaced, and it's largely probably being new, bigger pipe size, or it's Unfortunately, sometimes repairing a break, it's an emergency repair. We want to get ahead of those, address the biggest risks, reduce that cost. It's way more expensive to respond to a break and all of the damage that comes with it than it is to be proactive and address those vulnerable sections of the water system when they go. The most significant vulnerability in the system today are the two transmission mains that bring water down from Wicks to the city, the Milk Creek transmission line and the Highline transmission line, again, approximately 80 years old. They really have reached the end of their service life. And so it's time to start planning for that replacement, both for a more resilient pipeline, for the capacity that we anticipate bringing down from the Crow Creek source through Wicks to town, both in the winter and the summer. And then also because there is a significant energy along the way, or really at this point, wasted energy opportunity here to be able to think about storing that energy in the pipeline and then using it for renewable energy. So that's something we'll be looking at as well, is there the ability to implement hydropower along the line rather than just burning that energy at the bottom, but really making use of it and having a value from that. And with that, turn it over to Deb.
Just a quick question about that issue. I would hope that there's been many advances in the materials that are made that we don't have to worry about significant leakage and things like energy and things like that with the advancements and materials, for example. Could you?
Yeah. So as we said earlier, most of the older piping is cast iron pipe, and cast iron pipe has gone through some interesting evolutions to now modern ductile iron pipe, which is really just a variation on cast. Early turn of the century, 1900s, cast iron pipe that you still have in the ground is some of the most reliable pipe that's there. Interestingly enough, it's lasted 100 years and may go another 100 years. We've seen 1920s pipe that under the right conditions has not performed well. For whatever reason, 1950s cast iron fails at an amazing rate. It's unbelievable how poorly it has performed. In the 60s and 70s, we put in a lot of less expensive pipeline materials. Thankfully, the Dalles does not have a lot of that. That were the promise of less expensive, lighter weight, longer lasting pipe. They didn't prove out that way. And so as we've gone into ductile iron pipe in the 80s, we've learned more about how pipe can corrode, the kind of failure mechanisms that occur. There's been a lot of advancements in that. And so, yeah, modern ductile iron pipe, we can say with confidence, will typically, under the right conditions, installed correctly and maintained correctly, could have a 75-year life. And so we're seeing both more reliable pipe materials. We're using joint systems that keep the pipe more secure under the varying conditions we see, understanding seismic conditions, those types of things. I would say that Dalles has been smart to be careful about not always jumping on the bandwagon of the new material. There's something to be said for tried and true cast or ductile iron pipe when it's installed correctly.
Mr. Mayor.
And I would just add a little more to that. Our current standards, the only thing we allow in the distribution system inside the city is ductile iron pipe for the mains. We don't have, we haven't used PVC or any of the other materials. When we come to the design for some of these bigger projects, like replacing the pipelines from Wicks to the city, the transmission lines, I anticipate that there would be a similar analysis like we did for Dog River, looking at what the most cost-effective and appropriate material to use at that time was. We assumed for a long time that we would probably be using ductile iron pipe with the Dog River pipeline. And when it came time to actually do the project, we redid that analysis, and it was more cost-effective for us to use the fusible high-density polyethylene, a type of plastic pipe, much better and much more reliable than PVC. I would anticipate that same type of analysis to be part of the design for replacement of those transmission lines.
We're talking about, there's always a possibility of breaks in existing lines and so forth. You've dealt with them in the past. Do you build that into your budget for this project as well as our ongoing other needs?
Yeah, so the response to breaks finds its way into our annual operations budget. We just deal with those as they come up. The scheduled and planned replacement is going to be part of this effort, part of this planning effort to replace major sections of some of the most vulnerable pipe soonest. And try to at least create, understanding we're not going to get to a point where we have a very high level of resiliency with every single piece of pipe in town. But what we do want to do is create a reliable backbone has resilience to it, that has good survivability of an earthquake and isn't prone to breakage just because it's old and the temperatures are changing like we currently have with some of our pipe. Get that backbone established, things that we can restore water service to vast areas of the community, and that would be the emphasis for the replacement plan.
As you know, I just like to have things vocalized so we have a record of it. And I appreciate your diligence. Thank you.
Quick question for me. Is there any dynamic in selecting the material for the pipe pre or post treatment plant? Does anything come into play there?
The change in water quality isn't necessarily a significant driver. Pipe material is going to be driven by the installation conditions. So, part of that is to use polyethylene pipe comes in 40-foot lengths generally versus ductile iron pipe in 18-foot lengths. So some of it is just the ability to get the pipe in place, the type of joint system you're going to use. And then ultimately, one of the biggest drivers really is the pressure. So, for example, coming down from Wicks right now, if it was operated the way it will be operated in the future, the pipeline would be under significant pressure at the bottom, closest as you get closest to the city, because you got several hundred feet of head pressure of water coming into it. And so not all pipe materials are designed or perform the same under that kind of pressure. So that polyethylene pipe, for example, you end up with pipe that could have a 3-inch wall thickness in order to be able to deal with that pressure versus ductile iron pipe. It really doesn't change. You're talking about the same thickness of pipe as if it was low pressure. So those are the kinds of considerations that end up being both feasibility of the pipe material being able to form that way. How much diameter do you lose? Inside diameter do you lose? So capacity do you lose with thicker pipe? And what's the weight and cost really are the drivers.
Actually, can we go back one? There we go. Yeah.
Hold for a second. If this is a good time to take a quick break, or if you want to keep going, we can offer that.
I think we're fine.
Fine. Okay.
Amy, is that mic functioning on your?
Testing.
Doesn't seem as loud as the others.
Testing. Just bring it closer.
Are you talking about the one on the right?
Is it? Testing. Thank you. So Deb Gallardi Rothstein Group, as Brian was discussing the different options and sort of a puzzle in terms of the water source, the financial analysis is similarly a bit of a puzzle. And our scope that's part of this master plan update is to do a comprehensive look. The main components you can see on the little pieces. I'll talk about each one as we go through. The development of the long-term financial plan is going to be key to identifying, ensuring that you have adequate revenue to meet various needs. They're looking at, for the improvements, a 20-year, 50-year period. For the financial plan, we care very much about the annual cash flow. So I'll be trying to work with them to pin down more precisely some of the timing, both in terms of the capital improvements as well as that demand curve, because that's going to be really key in evaluating whether there's adequate revenue at any point in time. The systems development charges, as we talked about, are another component funding source that we want to evaluate as meeting a portion of those capital improvement project costs. On the right side, we have the cost of service analysis and the rate design. So financial analysis is as much about overall revenue adequacy as it is about equity and fairness in how the costs get distributed to different customer types and intergenerational kind of customers today versus customers in the future. identifying those growth components. There is a lot of flexibility within state statute with respect to the SDCs, within rate making, accepted rate making practice to integrate your local policy objectives and priorities. So just for example, water conservation, loan eligibility, how much your rates are providing a price signal to serve water or use water efficiently. That can be incorporated into the rate structure. Affordability both can take the form of both affordability to developers on, as a consideration in setting the systems development charges, but also within a customer class. Are the rates more affordable to small volume users and more punitive to large volume users, or the reverse? So there's all sorts of options that we can look at within the rate design that can really be tailored to meet your specific needs and objectives. And as they talked about, an importance of resiliency and stability, we want to make sure that the financial framework is there to support the infrastructure to provide the water 24/7 and under all conditions. Okay. So that first piece is the long-term financial plan. It's like you would put together a plan for your home or your business. It's a cash flow analysis. We put together spreadsheets that first look at the sources of funds. Water system is an enterprise fund of the city, so it needs to be self-supporting. Those generally user fees are the most flexible and primary source of funding for both operation and maintenance costs and capital costs. Systems development charges, private development contributions are sources for capital improvements generally, specifically. And then we'll look at what cash reserves, available fund balance that you have in the bank today that can also be used in the short or longer term to meet capital improvements. There's some other sources of funds, interest income, other fees and charges that are also part of the equation, though are much smaller in terms of it's really the user fees that are the primary source. So we project forward user rates based on customer growth, what the trends are in the usage per account, which generally nationwide, in the region, locally, have been trending down, the use per account, low flow fixtures, all those sorts of things that contribute to lower water use per account generally. So we take those factors into account. On the expense side, we're looking at all of the operation and maintenance costs as well as the capital improvements. So on the operating side, it's the personnel, electricity, chemicals, things like that. And we project that forward, starting with your budget. And then for the capital funding, that's going to be obviously a big part of this. We need to consider your existing debt service, including the new debt that's coming on. And then we'll evaluate based on the types of projects, the other funding sources like private development contributions, SDCs, the timing, how much of the future capital you're going to do on a pay-as-you-go basis versus maybe looking at some additional debt in the future, perhaps. Those are all of the things that we'll be looking at and potentially bringing you back different options on how best to accomplish that. Obviously, what we're about is minimizing the rate increases, but also making sure that there are sufficient funds as needed to build out the capital improvements that are recommended in the plan. Reserves are going to be are and will continue to be an important part. One of the questions about the emergency, pipe breaks and things, there's lots of reasons to have reserves. One is that just for your operation and maintenance, the cash flow is not generally flat throughout the year. You need to have reserves just for balancing cash flow needs. Capital, reserves can take the form of those kind of emergency reserves, but also for smoothing capital, because these projects are generally they're lumpy. So if you've got a spike out in the future, we've got some reserves that we've been planning for to apply to that can minimize the amount of debt that you have to issue, or prevent the rates from having to increase in the short term to meet some large improvement. Equipment replacement, obviously, and asset replacement, all very important. So we'll be looking at reserves are both a source of funds, but they're also a kind of another requirement to plan and budget for as part of this long-term planning effort. The result of this will be the establishment of annual system-wide revenue increase needs. And we can go to the next slide. And the big question is going to be how, in your case, more so than a lot of my clients, is how much of that is going to come from growth in demand and just that additional water sales versus rate increases. So I just took the numbers that Brian had provided in terms of the initial budget, look at just where are the rates and what are they covering right now in terms of thinking about what capacity do you have currently to fund capital improvements over and above operation and maintenance costs. So you can see the purple bar, the largest segment there, that's the operating expenses. The little teal blue color next increment is capital transfers, which right now, based on the current budget that Dave had provided, is about 380,000. It's important to understand that that amount that is budgeted right now for capital has been decreasing, as there has not been a rate increase since 2014. So, like everybody else, inflation has been, consuming more and more of the rates in terms of the operation and maintenance of the system, and less is available to fund capital improvements. The good news is that projected growth that Emily showed, your average demand currently at about 4 MGD, million gallons per day, and going to about 6 MGD, about a 50% increase by perhaps 2030. That's a big increase. So that, all things being equal, the line there, which in the red dot in the middle, that's the current estimated revenue from rates, which is about $6 million. That's going to grow just because of that growth in demand. So, but that's where the timing is going to be a little bit tricky over the next 5 years or so, is how quickly is that going to come on to offset the need to raise rates in both the short term and the long term. So those are some of the things that we're going to be looking at, balancing, testing the sensitivity to different assumptions about the rate of growth and inflation, all of those sorts of factors. SDCs obviously have been planned and used, as well as your existing reserves, to right now cover part of your costs, beyond your operating costs. Rule of thumb, generally, industry best practices, the rates are sufficient to cover operating costs, the debt service, and usually there are requirements by the lending agencies that your rates are sufficient to cover debt service, as well as to fund whatever sort of routine capital replacement, and then saving debt in SDCs for the larger projects and capital expansion. So, Dave, you want to add anything else to that? I'm putting you on the spot, but
No,
kind of accurately.
You did. I think you accurately described that. And we talked briefly about this last year during our budget adoption process. Some of councilors may recall, I think I made the comment that we could have been talking about a rate adjustment last year, that we were to that point where our revenues had flattened out and inflation was eating into our ability to contribute to the reserves. You'll see under the first bullet up there that there's that phenomenon or that occurrence is documented. 3 years ago, we were putting in $2.3 million from our revenues were going straight into reserves because of the inflation that we've had over the last couple of years. And because our revenues have held steady and actually declined just a little bit, we're only putting in $380,000 in the proposed budget. So that's a pretty significant decrease. And that's why my comment in the opening remarks was it's really timely for us to be doing this analysis now. From 1994 to 2006, we went 12 years without a rate adjustment. And we dug deeply, and we were actually using the reserves just to cover our operating costs. And we weren't doing any capital projects, and we developed a backlog of projects that has taken us, from then till now to begin digging out. And I think it's prudent for us to have enough information to avoid that happening again. So that's kind of the context. We didn't propose in the budget for 24-25 that's currently been drafted. We have not included any rate adjustment. That's the $380,000 being contributed to reserve shown on her chart. And we didn't propose any rate adjustment because we knew this effort was underway, and I wanted the council to be able to make any decisions around rates with all the information it could possibly have, and based upon a thorough technical analysis of the financial needs. So I think unless there's questions, that's kind of the context or additional context of our current rate. And SDCs, we haven't changed since 2007. So they've not been adjusted for inflation or anything for the last, 17 years.
Is it part of your scope of work that you're gonna make a recommendation as to what the SDC should be? It is good. It costs us extra if you were to evaluate the park districts.
I have a slide on that. That's, yeah.
Off the top of my head, and I'm always looking for items that change the opinion and whatnot, but at this point, and maybe for another discussion with the council at another time, I'm not in favor of just jumping on SDCs or rates in light of the fact that we have substantial sums of money coming in over the next number of years from the Google projects and whatnot. And we haven't really discussed how that money is going to be used. And putting everything on the backs of the taxpayers is not my ideal way to go as a first choice. Okay. So, but those are probably discussions for us at another time, but
we're going to begin
that's great information what you gave me
in this presentation about what some of those options and opportunities are, especially related to, Deb already touched on it a bit. The future anticipated revenues are significant. How do we buy the time to get us from now until those revenues are coming in and those facilities are online? And then the possible role of outside funding, non-water utility funding to support what ends up being a capital improvement. So we're actually going to be considering some of that and be seeking some of that direction, I think, through these conversations.
Yeah. And I understand completely with a financial background, what you're talking about. SDCs sometimes are driven by the contracts and codicils of a loan. We may not need loans. So that's what I want us to look at.
I just have a quick question for Devin. It might be a question, but considering growth and where the city of the Dalles is with our urban growth, thing like that, growth as a revenue source also involves construction of additional infrastructure to support that growth, which then becomes a liability that you have to take care of. So can you just talk maybe a little bit about your approach in considering that in your modeling?
I'll take the first stab at it if you don't mind. And the first piece of that is that this master plan looks at potential future water needs inside the urban growth area. So not just the existing city limits, but it assumes that we're going to expand into those urban growth areas that are outside the city limits. So that's the first piece of that. And then I'll let Deb take.
So some of the infrastructure gets built generally by the developers themselves for funding their local sources. So that's one of the things I usually work with Consor about is, okay, what of the distribution system, what are the local lines? Because what we're after is the backbone infrastructure. That's what the SDCs and the rates generally recover. Of course, once those lines that developers put in, it then becomes the city's responsibility to operate, maintain, and eventually replace those. So they come into the picture later on. The water system costs are generally fixed. Much of the costs are fixed for a, don't really fluctuate in a linear fashion with the demand, which is why, when there's conservation and sales go down, the costs don't go down in proportion to that. So it's another thing that we have to keep in mind. And so yeah, I mean, growth is a helpful thing to the system in that it brings in additional revenue. There are some additional costs, some of which come later in the form of replacement after the developer funded improvements need to be replaced. But there is some increase in operation and maintenance, but it's not generally at the same rate as that. So it's just all the various assumptions and factors that we try to identify as best we can in the model.
Right. And so you may touch upon this later, but in your trend lines for different revenue sources, if there's a growth trend line on a 50-year time period, I imagine that growth trend line goes down as we build out into the area that we're constrained to. And at some point, we'll be fully built out in a sense, and we won't have those growth revenue sources to maintain the system. Okay.
Yeah. And, the level of conservatism that's in the, from a financial standpoint, I'm looking at, I prefer being conservative in terms of when that growth occurs, because, you need to have the money to we don't want to be painting too rosy of a picture. You're not going to have the money needed. When they're planning the system, the design of the system, they have to be conservative in assuming growth happens at a faster rate. So somewhere in between there is a, happy medium that we strive for.
Okay, next page.
So once we establish what that overall revenue need is, or the cost pie that we're trying to recover overall, then we get into some of what I find the more interesting questions about, well, who should be paying what proportion of that? And at the very least, we look at customer types, land use types like residential and non-residential. One of the things we'll be looking at this time is, should non-residential class be broken out into like an industrial class and a commercial class? Are there any other customer classes distinctions that we want to make? Sometimes there are differences by service type, regular use versus irrigation use, or service level, pressure zone. We'll look at all those things, and what we're looking at are differences, quantifiable differences in service requirements. So, you could say, well, right now, non-residential is about 62% of average water use, when residential is 38%. Should we just allocate the cost in that basis? Well, that's somewhat of an overly simplistic look at it, because as Brian was talking about, there are lots of costs that we want to look at those pressure points, fire protection, peak demands, peak that's driven by irrigation or cooling, industrial cooling kind of things. There are facilities, raw water storage, you're looking at, ASR specific facilities just to meet those peak demands. So the customer classes and individual customers that are driving those peak demands under a cost of service framework, we can allocate proportionately more costs to those classes. So that's really the heart of the cost of service rate analysis. And these factors also can be considered in terms of the systems development charges too, because it all relates to sizing of infrastructure and cost recovery. Just a basic primer on your current rate structure and some of this is one of the areas where we're hoping to get some initial feedback from you today on what kind of options you want us to consider. So right now, residential, commercial customer classes, commercial, including also industrial, institutional, things like that. In both cases, there is a fixed cost per month and a volume charge, two separate components of the rates. Fixed monthly charge varies by the size of the meter for all the customer classes, and it includes what we call a minimum quantity. So for a residential customer, most of which are served by a 3/4 inch meter, that fixed monthly charge is $55.30, and it includes the first 10,000 gallons water use. Anything over and above that gets charged the volume, additional volume rate of $1.68. Commercial has a lower minimum quantity, and so also has a lower meter size fixed component of the rate and a larger volume rate, $1.60. And within commercial class, there's a lot of variability in terms of the size of the meter, and those fixed charges increase size. You do also have a surcharge on outside city customers of 50%. That's pretty typical. And originally, I think that was related to some debt service requirements. But again, it's pretty standard practice for outside city customers to pay anywhere from 25 to 100% what the inside city pays. Okay, next slide. So, you know, again, the cost of service analysis really addresses equity across different classes. The rate design really about determining equity within the class. And so within, for example, the residential class, as well as it can also be used to, as we discussed, provide price signals about water use, affordability, all of those sorts of things. So we put together two charts to demonstrate kind of, you know, based on the usage of a residential customer, where you fall in terms of other utilities. And I, you know, just picked about a dozen or 15 utilities across the state, some of whom also have minimum charges in their fixed charge, and others, the majority of these other utilities do not. So you have a fixed component and you have a volume charge. That volume rate applies to every unit of water you consume. So in your case, it only applies to the overage amount. So you can see here that for a typical single family bill that uses 700 cubic feet or about 5,000 gallons a month, so half of your current minimum charge, you can see that the where those bills align for the different cities, and the percent in the box is the portion of the charge that comes from the fixed charge. Well, in your case, so somebody's using 5,000 gallons a month, it's they're going to just pay the minimum charge. Even though they're using half of 10,000, they're going to pay the full minimum charge for that month. So 100% of the revenue comes from fixed charge. It's a very stable rate design, because in most months, you know, your typical users are going to pay the flat amount. So it aligns with the understanding that most of the costs in the system are fixed, but it does have implications for how much that user, you know, is going to pay relative to a larger consumer. So again, this is for the typical, so just looking on the kind of the average use over the course of a year, about 5,000 gallons is kind of. So the rank for this set of utilities is you are 10 out of the 20. We can go to the next slide. So now we go to the 10,000 gallons a month. And you can see that your rank for this user is 16th out of 23, being 16th lowest. And so you shift down the scale, and that's because most of other utilities, as I say, charge for each additional unit. Whereas in your case, bill's going to be the same, 5,000 gallon user and the 10,000 gallon user. And everybody else is kind of moves up, or at least many of the utilities. Yeah.
But another question of that to analyze it would be in our community, how many people are using, 10,000 on a regular basis? Is it, a lot, or is it
Let's go to
some
the
small percentage?
She has that on the very next slide.
same way. So here's the distribution
All
of
right.
use. Now, this is for looking at the average annual for the year. We can also do these profiles in the summer and the winter. But if you look at just sort of typical over the course of the year, 70% of the accounts use less than the minimum. So the monthly mean, the average is about 8,000. The median, kind of where there's equal above and below, is about 6,500 gallons. So yeah, there's a lot of customers.
I'm glad I led you to that. I grew up on spreadsheets and things like this. Thank you.
So we're not getting 100% of our revenue off of the fixed charge. It's just typical that most people are paying their full bill comes off the fixed charge and not off the variable rate.
Exactly. Certainly not as much the case in the summer months when people are irrigating, using water at peak. But yeah, and you can see from that previous slide, if we can just go back there one more time, that the trend has been just because water supplies are getting more and more expensive as you develop that next source of supply. The trend has been to reduce or eliminate that fixed minimum charge. And again, it's totally local policy driven. But I will note that, when you do need to secure borrowing from like the state federal agencies, one thing they do look at is your rate structure. Because they want to see, are you encouraging efficient use of water? And so this, I know, has been an issue.
Yeah, and I'll just expand on that very briefly. I think there's 3 points in this slide. And one is, it's very unusual for a water utility to include as much water in their base rate as we do. There were some reasons for that. Previous councils wanted to try to avoid creating a disincentive to having a green community. They wanted to include more water in the base rate, not discourage irrigation. What we think we know now is the difference between having a green lawn and not having a green lawn probably doesn't fall within that 10,000 gallon decision. The second point that Deb was just talking about, water rates are an important element of what the state or the feds are looking at when we apply for funding. It was a very difficult conversation. It took me about 2 months, excuse me, when we were trying to secure the funding for Dog River, to get them to consider our full base rate, because that is the minimum a customer can pay, because we had so much water included in it, because we had as much water as we do included in it. And the difference in terms for that funding for the loan part, we finally talked them into getting the best terms that we could, even though we have 10,000 gallons. They wanted 7,500 or less. That's more of a normal number that they're used to seeing. The difference in terms was the terms that we got, 1% for 30 years, or I believe the alternative would have been 2.65%, so more than double the rate for only a 20-year period. So there was a real challenging conversation to finally be successful and get those better terms, just because of the 10,000 gallon number that's in our residential base rate. And the third point I was going to make, we don't hear it a lot, but when we do have conversations about water rates, we often will hear from our customers, I don't use 10,000 gallons. Why am I paying for 10,000 gallons? I want more control over my water bill. In the summertime, in the wintertime, I'm only using 2,000 or 3,000 gallons. or something closer to 5. And yet I'm having to pay for 10. That is a comment that we hear from our customers. So those were the 3 points that I kind of wanted to raise. I think we'll be seeking some direction or some input from council yet today on what your preferences or thoughts are as we move forward with developing rate scenarios. But this is, I think, an important topic. It's a policy decision that we'll be looking for guidance from the council on what your preference would be as we move forward with the financial analyses.
Just a comment, it may or may not be useful to look at some average monthly uses just to inform that conversation, right? If we were to say, okay, dear customer, we're going to charge you a slightly lower rate for 5,000 gallon, base flow. And they're going to be like, great, I can control that. But then they're going to come back in July and say, it went spiked up. It would be useful to be able to know what impact current use would have under a different fee structure for like most are our common, average neighbors, so to speak, but also for collecting and administering the system.
And we actually see that response now, even with the existing rate structure. We usually see that response in May. It starts warming up. People are getting their irrigation systems going. They've been paying the flat rate all winter long. And all of a sudden, and they won't turn everything on outside. They will have an increase in their water bill for the month of May. And then we'll see them actually pull back their own use, oftentimes throughout the rest of summer as they're using that feedback from their. So that is certainly an existing phenomena, whether we're at 10,000 gallons or some other volume in the future.
I think it might be on the next slide.
Go to the next slide. Yeah, so
Average usage.
Does that slide kind of answer the question you were raising? So there you can see, 70% of our accounts on a year-round basis, right? This was a year-round, just a monthly bill average, Deb,
yeah,
are less than the 6,500. Is it 6,500 or 8,000 gallons? Less than a minimum.
or less
Oh,
than
less
the
than
10,000.
Less than 10,000.
Yeah. So that's the percent that are using less than the current minimum. And I didn't calculate, if we go down to 7,500, what percent is that, or 5,000? We can certainly provide all that information. The challenge of, we've got a lot of dials that we're turning here, potentially, that are going to impact individual customer bills. One of them is the overall revenue needs and whether any general rate increases are going to be needed. How costs may or may not shift between residential and non-residential as part of the cost of service analysis. So it may be that overall residential costs go down or up, and then within the class. So, if we look at different options for the minimum charge, that shifts costs to higher volume users. So it's going to be important to for us to try to isolate those and explain those potential impacts, and to look at we can certainly look at the just isolate this issue about the minimum charge and what would the customer bill be under today's rates, or a certain assumption about the future revenue requirements, just so council can see, well, okay, on this particular issue, what is going to be. But we can't do that for you right now, other than to say that there are a lot of customers, majority of customers on an average basis are using less.
Mr. Mayor, I have a couple more questions. Is this the appropriate time or you want me to wait?
I hope we can wrap things up by 11 o'clock. So, yeah, go ahead.
So at what point do we as council and staff start wrestling with sort of philosophy of our rate structures? Is this later in the year?
Well, I think we'd love to get some guidance on which other options you'd like to see. So, if the information that's been provided is compelling enough to say, yeah, we should look at lowering that minimum and, we'd like you to look at 7,500 or 5,000 or do away with it all, that would be helpful information.
All right. Second,
We can develop those options.
fair enough. Just to confirm my understanding, Dave, I think this is for you. So we went 10 years ago, we had a pretty significant rate bump in our user rates.
We had a series of them. Yes.
Right. And it was a bit of a shock because we'd gone for 10 or 12 years prior to that, sort of holding the line and never making people pay because we're trying to make it affordable for our neighbors. And now we find ourselves kind of potentially in that situation again. And correct me, please, but is my understanding correct that over the last 10 years, we've been able to essentially hold the line because we've covered our costs with our non-residential, our
It's been
industrial?
both. It's been all classes. It's been growth in all classes, but yeah, the heavy lifting has been done by increases in industrial water use.
And now they're using the majority of our water and will. And
The
Freeze
existing
too.
facilities and the existing use in the community has kind of flatlined for the last 3 or 4 years.
but we're going to have a couple of heavy users coming along pretty soon. That's why they're putting big pipes in the ground.
Yes.
Okay. Well, this is just my 2 cents. I'm one of 5 or more people in this conversation, obviously, but I'd like to see where possible, our industrial customers continue to shoulder the heaviest portion of the load.
I think that one of the things that we really wanted to be an important part of this financial analysis is something that Deb already mentioned, but it's probably worth emphasizing, and that's that equity amongst customer classes. We want to be sure that one class of users isn't subsidizing the water
Well, yeah, right,
service.
but I'm pushing back on that and saying I don't know that that's necessarily would be if I were king of the world. I'm not sure that would be my goal. I think my goal would be to have our friends at Google subsidize the rest of us
So
to some degree. I'd
yeah.
rather they're never going to go and get worry about where their next rent or mortgage check is coming from, but there's plenty of our neighbors that do, and I'm very happy to have them as industrial customers and neighbors. But again, just for my 2 cents, not speaking for anyone else, I want them to shoulder the heaviest burden.
Okay, and I think the only thing, a caveat I would offer to that is any rates that we adopt need to apply to everybody within that class. We couldn't
Yep.
just pick out one user and charge them a different rate. In fact, that's a specific paragraph in the most recent development or infrastructure agreement. And it would be
Understood.
all industrial users would be rolled up into that concept, if you understand.
Understood. I was
Okay.
using them as a shorthand for industrial users.
Yes.
But in defense of what you just said there, which was very pointed, that company has just provided us with a well
Mhm.
that's going to help this community substantially, and I very much appreciate that.
Yeah,
Two
there's
wells.
from the, $28.5 million worth of water and sewer improvements that are being developed and paid for and handed to the city from one particular industry. Yes.
Which is also going to benefit the rest of the cities, which we can get into some other time. I'm a little skeptical we're going to be able to, this is a complicated issue, and providing you with this kind of feedback that you might be looking for today with this information we're getting, I think might be a lot to ask. That's all. Yeah.
If we could go to the next slide. Yes, you're absolutely right. Right. We can't tell you right now, I don't know what the CIP phasing that Brian's going to, and Emily are going to come back with is going to look like, and how that's going to align with the projected growth and the revenue. So we can't really say, we're going to have to come back to you with those, with some scenarios on that. I think this is the kind of feedback though that is going to be helpful just to point us in the direction of scenarios to develop in terms of the customer classes. And I'm hearing, yeah, we need to look at industrial as a separate class. And we need to look at, from within a cost of service framework, certainly every opportunity where there is some differentiation of service that we can identify and quantify and have those rates reflect that cost. On the minimum charge, I don't, we have maybe a short discussion on that now, or maybe what additional information might be helpful.
Yeah, and I think, Deb, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if we just got some direction from the council today, that could either be, we absolutely want to keep 10,000 gallons as the minimum rate or the minimum quantity that's included in the base rate, or yes, we're open to looking at changing that amount. Just that level of direction from the council today would help us move forward and eliminate some things off the table if, with that information. If council absolutely wants to keep the 10,000 gallons, which is absolutely your prerogative to do, we won't spend time looking at 5,000 gallon and 7,500 gallon options, for example. But if there is a willingness to look at some other quantities included in that base rate, we'll do the work.
How confident are you that 10,000 gallons represents an accurate assessment of the fixed costs of our water system? I mean, if that's impossible to answer at this point, I, for one, am open-minded, but I want to point out the obvious, and that is when we start changing the rates, you're going to have people that are going to be paying more, and you have people that are going to be paying less. And I don't think our council chambers are going to be filled with anybody that is going to be thanking us for them paying less. So just a little caution there, that's all. So.
Yeah, and I don't think I have a good answer for you to say 10,000 gallons represents, because it's really an arbitrary number that's been included in the base rate, and the rates have been generated around that.
You're not
Right.
confident at all.
In saying that quantity somehow reflects the cost of service, correct? I'm not confident. I will say that historically, we were at 15,000 gallons, and I think it was in 2006 or 2007, we went down to the 10,000 gallons for residential, and we reduced commercial, I think, from 10 to the 5. So those adjustments, have occurred. Just
that-
for whatever it's worth.
Was that for dollars or for gallons? Because I remember we had a lot of shortages back in the day, or,
Well,
summer.
the
summer
shortages, we used to every year impose water use restrictions, but that's before we had meters at all.
Mhm.
So there was no consumptive billing. It was all the water they could use for, at that time, I think $26 a month. Since we installed meters, and since there has been a consumption component of our billing, we haven't had to do water restrictions at all. So, I mean, that was a big step forward, and having the system metered is pretty much now a absolute first level of evaluation requirement for any outside funding. They just won't even talk to us. Deb may recall that I think it was 94, we had undertaken a rate analysis. Again, we were really behind at that point. The council at that time really wanted to get as much conservation incentive out of the rates, and the first rates that were adopted are what we actually call an increasing block rate. And I won't remember the exact numbers now, but it was like the first 10,000 gallons of use was at a certain per 1,000 gallon volume. And then the next 10,000 or 15,000 was at a higher rate. So water got more expensive the more that you use. And there was the intent was to try to get as efficient a use of the water the city had available through its rates. That didn't last long. It was a couple years, I think, before we came back and just had one consumptive rate for all the consumption that occurs for the resident above the 10,000 gallons. So there's a lot of things that we can look at in rate scenarios if we understand what the council's preferences are.
Dave, what about the customers who use the like averaged out over a year? I forget what you call it. There's a service I think you offer. It's voluntary at this point, where you don't have the spikes. You don't pay extra for the months you spike, but you average it out over the year, so your bill's the same each month. So if you were to drop it down to 5,000 gallons a month, if you provided that option, I suppose, or maybe
Yeah, I mean, I
structure it
think
that way.
we any rate structure that, unless we're directed to do something else, any rate structure we could still do the billing equalization or whatever you call it over the course of the year. We would still anticipate offering the 2 levels of low income or subsidized water rates that we currently have. And those are triggered through information from MCAP, Community Action Program. They're the ones that actually make the determination about whether a person qualifies as low income or not. So we would anticipate, again, unless directed to otherwise, we would anticipate continuing those types of things and whatever new rate structure was implemented.
Looks like from the chart here, if we were somewhere at 8,000 or so, we'd only have to argue with 30% of the population then.
Something like that.
Do we need,
It's the SDCs I worry about more than anything because
Was in just a second.
that affects building costs and housing costs, and we're trying to do things to keep those prices down.
Mayor, I just want to make one comment just to keep this in mind while we're figuring out how to best do this, that we recently made landlords responsible for water if the tenant, thank you, doesn't pay their bill. And so I see a couple things around this, that being one. The other thing is with like automated sprinklers, for example, this happened to me, and so it's why it's fresh in my mind. I'm paying the water bill where I was renting a house. I didn't control the automated sprinkler during the summer. My water bill went crazy. And so that's just something I want to toss out there, is that those are things we need to think about too, is how we create equity for residents.
Yeah, and I think, part of the intent or one of the opportunity, I think, with rates is, I guess, to create to motivate, to incentivize
Sure.
that type of control, so that people can have control over their own bills. And I understand the challenges of a rental and what a renter might be doing. And we did actually, as you mentioned, it's correct that we recently changed the rules so that water and sewer accounts are to be in the name of the property owner unless they're already grandfathered in or other arrangements have been made. And that's because we were getting stiff so often. When it was in the name of a renter, they would just
Oh, yeah.
leave, not pay their bill, and the account was in their name. So we did make that change 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, and I'm not arguing with how that is. I just wanted to put that forward and make us like just be thinking about it as we're deciding which way we're going to go.
I had a question for you, Deb. That's all right. On your very next slide, where you start talking about SDCs, there's an image of the cover page for the study that you were part of preparing for the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department. I read this study a few months ago as I was doing some research, and so I actually didn't know that you would be here today, which is great. And I know the LOC does its best to get a good survey of the different types of SDC methodologies and rates throughout the state, and tying this back into water use. I believe this LOC also has a number of different surveys connected with water rates. But I haven't seen anything, let's say, official. I know that the LOC has self-reported. Different communities throughout the state will give ideas until, just candidly have conversations like this. And they'll say, yeah, we do this and this is what works for us. I think what might be helpful for council would be something more official, something sort of like this study from regarding SDCs, but with respect to water rates, the different methodologies that are implemented throughout the state, different ways to look at these questions. I can't imagine very many of the questions that council are asking today are unique to the city of the Dalles. I feel like these are conversations that have happened and have been happening throughout the state for 40, 50 years. There are certainly pros and cons associated with all of these different approaches. I don't know what they are. Dave might know what most of them are, but I was wondering if you had a resource that could be more comprehensive so that council could have a more informed ability to give some direction, and in less than 20 minutes. And so,
Yeah, well, so there is a national survey on utility rates that's done every other year by American Water Works Association in partnership with Raftellus Consultants. And it looks at rate structures and rate levels and reserves and all different practices of different size utilities and utilities in different parts of the country. So, I mean, that information is certainly available. You're right, League of Oregon Cities does think I don't remember when their last water rate study was done. I want to say like 2021 or something like that. And there's a lot of data in there and it's, you know, but it does touch on, you know, the different rate structures that you used, inclining blocks or uniform volume rates, and if there's a minimum charge and those sorts of things. So, I think those are the two most, available information, survey-like information. Then there's within the water rate making industry, we have the American Water Works Association publishes a manual, the M1 manual on rate setting. If you want to do a deeper dive into understanding what the different rate structures are and things, it's thick though. It's
Yes, it's complicated.
yeah.
So tell you what, I'll give you my business card after this. Maybe we can connect on email.
Absolutely.
Okay,
I'd be
terrific.
happy to. You know, we can certainly develop kind of a memo or, you know, some sort of written document, can work with Dave to talk about what some other kind of interim deliverable that would maybe help council as you consider some of these different policy.
I almost imagine like a top 3, top 5 most commonly used types of structures for determining water rates and the relative pros and cons for the average citizen of that community and for the average city government. Something like that. I'm not assigning work, but I would like to see that personally. I'm not a member of the council, but I just think, I don't know, anybody can jump in if I'm talking out of line. I just think that would be useful and important for this community.
Okay, should I do a quick on the SDCs and then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you see any problem wrapping up by 11?
No, I can go fast.
But this is important stuff, so I don't want you to feel rushed. So.
Well, and apologies, we had originally scheduled for 3 hours and then we were like, well, so anyway, whatever. So SDCs, one-time fees on new development. I think everybody's aware of that. Point I want to make here is that there is flexibility. I think as Mayor asked, you know, what flexibilities do city have in terms of setting the formulas for these? There is a fair amount of flexibility, and I'll talk about that in the next slides. Oh yeah, you were perfect. So we are required under Oregon law, as you develop and if you're going to implement a new SDC and SDC methodology, have to meet certain requirements. We have to take the project list from the master plan. We have to identify what the costs of each project are, the timing, approximate timing, and how much is related to future growth, expansion versus rehabilitation, replacement of existing infrastructure. Methodology then is that framework for, well, for some of these projects, you know, it serves a dual purpose, you know, to maybe raise the level of performance of existing infrastructure. Is that a benefit to existing development or future development? So we have to, within the methodology, you know, what factors are we going to look at? Are we looking at fire protection, peak demands, or just average demands? That is kind of the core, and I work closely with Consor to evaluate each of those projects and how we're going to determine the growth share. The ultimate decision of council is, you know, we can take the project list, this methodology, product of those two things is SDCs that come out of that, but it establishes basically the maximum allowable, we call it. That's not a technical term, defined term in statute, but the point is that council decides what is the fee level that you want to charge and how best to balance the affordability. And let's go to the next slide of the rates and the SDCs, because the SDCs are an important part of funding future, you know, capital costs, as well as they can be a mechanism through this reimbursement fee for capturing costs that have been already facilities that have already been developed. So as those lumpy investments, we generally have excess capacity in certain facilities that have already been paid for or that debt service is continuing to pay for. the SDCs can pay for a portion of that to the extent that portion of that capacity is available. So the statute very clearly says you can have an improvement fee for the future looking. Got to say how you've determined it to be, what portion is growth related. Then you can have a reimbursement fee, city paid for facilities, they have available capacity, and recover that portion retrospectively, and then use that money for ongoing repair and replacement of the system. So both vehicles help to take pressure off the rates. And then the compliance costs, it's not an unfunded mandate in this case. It's not a mandate at all. You don't have to charge them. But if you do, you can also recover the costs associated with my time and developing the project list, counting, meeting certain statutory requirements. So there is guidelines, but lots of flexibility in here in how we determine those amounts. Next slide. So, yeah, it's been a long time since the water SDCs were developed. So I've flipped the scale a little bit on this. You've got the highest ones on the left and the lowest one on the right. You are, of this group of cities, the lowest. Your total SDC is dominated by the Parks SDC currently. The water SDC is about half the statewide average. So as part of that study that I was part of for the state, we did pull in some, where there was available data on other cities and districts to SDCs. Roughly, it was about $5,000 for a typical residential unit. Yours is about $2,300, and the SDC varies by size. But of course, when developers pay the SDCs, they're not so much interested in what's the water portion, what's the sewer portion, it's the total. And so you can see that both in terms of water and in terms of total, standing parks being quite large, that you are still lowest of these communities, which I think is pretty representative statewide of the range of this. And there are still some communities that don't charge SDCs. Pendleton, for example, there are some in Eastern Oregon where, Pendleton is looking to develop those in some of the other Eastern Oregon cities. So there are some that are 0 for water and 0 overall. Okay, next slide. So that's my quick thing on SDCs. I think key policy issues, we've already talked about rates. On the SDCs, it's going to be, we'll give you what comes out of the plan, and the technical analysis says what is you could charge. What the council decides to charge is really a local policy decision. We will need to make assumptions in the financial plan and the rates about how much revenue is going to come from SDCs, and that part of that will be dictated by what council feels is an appropriate level. And then certainly the design of the SDCs, how you want to consider charges for accessory dwelling units or smaller housing types. Right now, you charge based on the meter size, and within a given meter size, you can have a fair amount of flex range of housing units that serve. Do you want to have any special considerations for ADUs or middle housing and non-residential, how we factor in some of the specific higher demands or capacity requirements, fire protection. I don't think, we're not looking for obviously specific recommendations today because we don't know. Is the maximum allowable going to be 2 times, 3 times what you charge now? That remains to be seen.
Yeah, and I guess just a comment on our current ones. I mentioned they haven't been adjusted since 2007. One of the things you can do with SDCs is annual adjustments based on CPI or, some other appropriate measure. We haven't done that, so they haven't even kept up with inflation. But we also chose not to charge the max rate that we could justify in any of our 4 utilities, water, sewer, transportation, or storm. So they're already below what could have been justified in 2007 under the old master plan. So I fully expect that we're going to be able to come, we will be coming to the council with updated results of a new analysis saying, I don't have the number, but saying, the city could charge up to this amount. Then it's going to be, a policy decision. How much of that do we implement? Do we make any changes at all? Do we start to consider the annual adjustments for inflation so that even if we only adopt it, I'll make up a number, 50% of what could be justified, at least that will be keeping up with 50% as we move forward. And the other point with STC, I mean, Councilor Runyon hit it on the head. We hear about it from developers because it's a check they have to write at the point that they're getting their building permit. We hear it almost exclusively, and Josh could kind of maybe confirm, our planning community development director. Last I knew, we almost exclusively hear those comments or concerns raised by local developers. As Deb indicated, we're low when we compare it to other communities, and people that are coming from outside the community to develop in the Dalles go, wow, this is great. Let me let you write you a check for that amount and get on with my project. And I think, without getting too deep into it, I've got, there's some philosophical elements of SDCs to me is these are costs that are incurred to provide the capacity to support new development. And if we don't collect them in SDCs, that is, if developers aren't paying their fair share, our ratepayers have to do that. So that's the trade-off with the SDCs. And we don't really see, it hasn't been my experience that we see housing rates, housing sale costs be based on cost plus. I'm going to build this house for $200,000 and I'm going to sell it for 20% more than that, and that's my profit. So if we lower SDCs, the cost of the house comes down. I think we see these sales being set at what the market will bear. And so that's just my two unofficial cents worth. I see some nodding. Unless there's a very specific program in place, which we don't have yet, that may focus on affordable housing, where it does become more of a cost plus type of program for what the sale price of that house is going to be. I don't see a lot of change in housing costs if we were to, for example, lower SDCs. Now, there's a limit to that. I mean, if we were some of these Wilsonville numbers or some of these numbers from other communities of $50,000 or $60,000 for SDCs, but we're at like $6,000 for the cities, all four combined.
Could we add some cities to the list here? If you,
Sure.
Pendleton, I know is 0. So, but if they do raise if they institute a SDC, I'd like to see that one. Hermiston is another one. There's no coastal communities on here. I think Astoria or Newport or Lincoln City might be close to our population size. So I'd appreciate getting those.
Hermiston has some kind of unique characteristics too that might skew it a little bit. And that's that they have a large industrial port that ends up paying a lot of the municipal system costs.
Are you only going to be looking at the water, stormwater, and sewer SDCs, or also transportation?
No,
Just water. Yeah.
Or just water?
this is just the water master
Just the
plan.
water. That's what I figured. We're talking about a lot of different things here, like parks and things of that nature. Just water.
Now,
Mayor.
Yeah, Rod.
As part of what I've been saying, I didn't realize the SDCs had not adjusted. I thought they had, and they haven't. So that would be my first place, is to put some sort of a CPI or something to that. I wouldn't have a problem with that at all. That's pretty much expected. And I would have the planning department keep a chart there showing all the other cities that charge way more than what we do. That would be nice to have in their public relations file. But that would be the first place I would go. Secondly, I would look at maybe we go from 10,000 to 8,000, but I don't think we need to do that right away. It's somewhere in this presentation, there was something about a 2-year cycle to figure all of this out as far as our actual usage and where we're going and costs and all of that?
I think that was when I was talking about our aquifer storage and recovery program
Yeah.
and whether the aquifer responds correctly or not.
Yeah, and that kind of relates directly to the money we're going to need, does it not?
Not a little bit, I guess, in terms of what the future supply options end up being for the city and how that might impact the capital improvement plan. I don't think it's as much of an element of our financial plan that we're talking about now. It's going to be more water sales driven, demand driven. When some of these new, and we all see it, we've got two big new facilities being constructed, as data centers on the east end town or west end of town. And the timing of when we'll start selling water to those facilities is part of our analysis, and how do we cover the gap between then and now and some of those things.
And the other part of that is relating to what the state requires regarding SDCs and all of that, and the ratio to money. The allowability of us supplementing that difference by funds that we're gaining in this community because of a lot of work over the last 15 years. And are we allowed to do that? Can we supplement some of that rather than just raising water rates and raising SDCs flat out? Because if we have the funds to do major projects, it would be nice if we could use some of that money to help our ratepayers as well as those building homes.
Yeah. So some really good points there. And I'm going to defer to Matthew here just a little bit if I can, because our next planned get together with the council about water financial issues is August, another work session trying to pin down further some decisions around what the financial plan we would include in the master plan will look like. Between now and that August meeting, Matthew, I think we're going to be having some conversations about use of some of those other funds and what they might look like.
Correct. So what we've it's this conversation really highlights it. What we've tried to tentatively schedule this year is weaving together three different topics. There's the water master plan, there's the housing production strategies conversation that we'll have on Thursday, and then there's another work session tentatively scheduled with Wasco County Board of County Commissioners to talk about some of these revenue streams, such as the strategic investment program and some of one of the enterprise zone agreements that we have, and how they might be considered in some of these topic areas.
And so we fully expect to incorporate whatever decisions are made from that conversation into this financial plan conversation, which I think is your point. There might be other sources of revenue that could be considered. And in one of Deb's earlier slides, she had other funding sources or something like that as something that we're going to be looking at once we have some direction of what those might look like.
I'm really glad to hear that, because sitting on urban renewal, a lot of times the projects don't pencil out. And if it's in the urban renewal area, then we can pay the SDCs. But I do worry about right now where we're trying to increase our housing stock, raising SDCs, even though they're low comparatively. We haven't had a huge housing boom here because they are low. So I'm glad to hear that we'll be looking at all the different ways that interacts as a puzzle piece.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also wonder if we're nibbling around the edges of the question with the SDCs. I mean, even if we doubled them, so say we jumped them up $2,000 a meter, and we had sudden housing boom at 100 units, we're talking about a couple $100,000. That's just not that much in the big scheme of things, right? Compared to our other sources of revenue for the water system. And I hope that we are focused on the big sources and keep things in proper perspective. And my guess is that goes back to industrial or non-residential use service fees.
And one of the things we are definitely going to be looking at is our methodology for water SDCs. Currently, as Deb mentioned, it's just based on meter size. And I'll give you a very general example. Large industrial development that was assessed $200,000 in water SDCs because it's just based on the size of the meter that's coming in.
Yeah.
Yet in the wastewater, the sewer side, we look at the actual volumes to be generated. And the SDC collected was in the millions of dollars. So there's a bust there in my mind. There are utilities that have of equal or equivalent size. They're both $6 million utilities, right? But we have a methodology for the sewer that we really do capture significant revenues, significant SDCs from those new large users. And part of our effort is to look at, is there a better way to be doing the water SDCs rather than just meter size? Let's start talking about their actual impact on what the city's supply needs are. So that's part of it too. Deb, did I misstate any of that? As part of that, we talked about either equity amongst customer classes or, being sure each customer class is paying appropriately for the demands they put on the system. That applies not only to user fees, but the SDCs. And the required methodologies allow us to do that.
Well, do you feel like you have sufficient direction to come back on August 19th?
Yeah, and I think the ones I heard
Yes.
is I think there's a willingness for the team to look at alternative volumes of water in the base rate. I think I only heard from Councilor Runyon, but I think there's possibly a willingness to look at annual adjustments or inflation-based adjustments to SDCs, regardless of whatever level we start setting them at. Was there a willingness to look at these customer classes and the level of service costs, which I think that's, really helpful to us to be able to do that.
Yeah, and we'll put together an issue paper that is specific to the rate structure issue to help council have additional context.
You've done a lot of these rate studies, haven't you? You ever come back with one that recommends lower rates for? Didn't think so.
Yeah.
Okay,
It's tough when these master plans also include a capital improvement plan, which is a whole list of new projects that need to be funded, right?
okay. Anybody else? Last minute questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll see you August 19th. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
No clue that I had so much knowledge about water and dollars.